Next on Secrets of War. They were the best-kept secrets of the air campaign in the Gulf War. The controversial strategic plan to wipe out Iraqi targets. The classified missions of airborne spy planes, and the clever deception that used harmless decoys to overwhelm Baghdad's air defense network. Steel Rain in the Gulf War is next on Secrets of War.
Operation Desert Storm has been described as the definitive demonstration of air power in war. For true believers, television images of laser-guided bombs flying through ventilation shafts were proof that the technology of strategic bombing had at last caught up with the doctrine. That air power alone reigned supreme among the gods of war. As the raucous homecoming celebrations and victory parades faded from view, the true story of the 43-day air war against Iraq remained cloaked in secrecy or obscured behind waves of breathless Pentagon press releases.
Deployed in the Kuwaiti Theater of Operations, our mission.
Only recently have hidden details begun to emerge, revealing levels of ingenuity and frustration that more fully depict the complexities of the air campaign.
That's one of the prophecies I made that was true, is that said 10 years from now I'll still be writing about this war, and we're still doing it. We're still finding some of the pieces, unraveling some of the pieces.
As significant as the Gulf War has been to subsequent military developments, in a very real sense, it caught American leaders by surprise. In the summer of 1990, relations between Iraq and Kuwait had not been a priority for the United States. For most of the previous decade, in fact, U.S. Mideast policy was preoccupied with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which had toppled the pro-Western Shah and subjected America to prolonged and agonizing ridicule.
We came to see Iran as the single greatest threat in the region, more dangerous than anything else out there. We were looking for almost any force that we could use to try to weaken the Iranians, contain them, and prevent them from causing mischief. And Saddam was a ready candidate.
Saddam Hussein had shown his West leanings by attacking revolutionary Iran at the time of the revolution. So we had the interesting situation of Russia, France, the United States, in total some 29 countries supporting Saddam Hussein, a total eventually of a little over $30 billion being spent on arms.
Just as important to the Iraqis was intelligence on the movement of the Ayatollah's forces, information that helped break the back of the Iranian army. Information that was provided by the Central Intelligence Agency. During the fall of 1989, world attention was fixed on dramatic events unfolding in Europe. As the West celebrated the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Iraq's costly war with Iran was harvesting bitter fruit. Iraq was nearly bankrupt. Appeals by Saddam Hussein to his Arab neighbors for financial assistance fell on deaf ears.
At the end of the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam had this enormous army, and what's more, he'd also built a huge defense industry to try to support the army. At the same time, he had to promise Iraqis a certain standard of living. Otherwise, he was afraid that they would become very disillusioned against the war, and more importantly, that threats to his regime would increase. Kuwait was right next door, and Saddam saw Kuwait as the money vault just across the border.
Long-simmering territorial disputes boiled over, including accusations that the Kuwaitis had stolen billions of dollars worth of Iraqi oil. Saddam's tone grew increasingly belligerent during the summer of 1990, all while he reassured both Arab leaders and the United States that he had no intention of invading Kuwait. Then, on the 25th of July, he summoned American Ambassador April Glaspie to a private meeting. It would be a pivotal encounter.
What she basically said to Saddam was, the United States would like to see you resolve this dispute with Kuwait peacefully. However, we are not going to get involved in the details of the dispute. And what Saddam seems to have heard there was, the United States is probably not going to intervene, is probably not going to act to oppose an Iraqi move against Kuwait.
As troops massed in southern Iraq, operational control of American spy satellites shifted from the CIA to the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, indicating an increased likelihood of war. Some analysts warned of an Iraqi invasion, but the new administration of President George Bush relied instead on the personal assurances of Arab leaders that Saddam was only bluffing. In the meantime, the Iraqis, as part of their invasion plans, had quietly obtained commercial satellite coverage of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The imagery was sold by the French, with no questions asked. On the 1st of August, an estimated 300 tanks and 100,000 Iraqi soldiers were poised on the Kuwait border. U.S. intelligence declared Watch Condition 1, the probability of imminent hostilities. From an intelligence standpoint, it was a milestone event in the waning days of the Cold War.
All of the national collection assets, meaning spy satellites, spy planes, all of this kind of thing, were given that as their number one priority. And that was the first time in 40 years that the former Soviet Union ceased to be the number one priority.
The CIA issued a final warning to the National Security Council. An invasion would come in 24 hours. At 2 a.m. on the 2nd of August, 1990, Iraqi forces crossed over the border into Kuwait. The entire country was occupied in 6 hours. The United Nations condemned the invasion and demanded an immediate withdrawal. Saddam Hussein's intentions were unknown. There was little stopping him from continuing into Saudi Arabia. That scenario weighed heavily on the Bush administration. On the 7th of August, F-15s of the 1st Tactical Fighter Wing took off from Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. 15 hours and 9 aerial refuelings later, they arrived in Saudi Arabia. The arrival of these F-15s was the first tangible demonstration of America's resolve to protect her access to precious Persian Gulf oil. Another group of American airmen was also on the way to Saudi Arabia, the crew of a large antenna-studded reconnaissance aircraft. For many years, a familiar presence in hotspots around the world, but whose mission and capabilities had long been shrouded in secrecy. Modern conflict is sustained by electronic information. What was known as signals intelligence during the Second World War is now broadly defined as electronic warfare, encompassing everything from computers to radio communications to aircraft and missile radars. For the intelligence analyst, acquiring an electronic blueprint of the enemy's capabilities is as vital as the information provided by more traditional photographic and human sources. This blueprint is called an electronic order of battle.
The electronic order of battle tells us about an enemy's electronic capabilities: radars, early warning systems, surface-to-air missiles, tracking radars, things like that.
Within days of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, an RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft was in the skies over the Persian Gulf. One of the several modifications of the Boeing KC-135 aerial tanker, this version of the RC is called Rivet Joint. Its mission is to collect information to establish an electronic order of battle. It's one of America's most critical and most highly classified spy planes. The RC-135 Rivet Joint is not as widely known as other reconnaissance platforms, such as the SR-71 and the U-2. And that is for a reason. The plane's operators avoid publicity. It's not found at air shows, and unlike the E-3 AWACS, whose mission of watching the skies is often widely promoted for diplomatic reasons, the arrival of a Rivet Joint on station is always low-key.
What they're doing is looking and listening. They're seeing where those electronic emissions are coming from, where the radars are. They're mapping and mapping. They're saying these units are here. This missile is over here.
Knowing those frequencies, it's now possible to develop countermeasures, either to jam them, to send them spurious information, ultimately to defeat those as potential threats.
Any information broadcast over the electromagnetic spectrum can be monitored, analyzed, and stored by Rivet Joint's onboard systems, or passed on in real time to any place in the world. A fleet of 17 of these aircraft are based at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, home of the 55th Wing. But the aircraft regularly deploy from bases in England and Japan.
We're deployed on a daily basis. About 50% of the fleet is out there servicing our requirements. Our folks are on the road a lot.
Among the many distinguishing characteristics of the Rivet Joint is its air-to-air refueling capability.
The commanders would like to keep us airborne round the clock and out there to collect and keep an eye on the world. I have flown in RC for 27 and a half hours. That's my longest sortie. It's a long time to be crammed up in an airplane.
For most of its operational career, the Rivet Joint orbited along the boundaries of the former communist bloc, listening to and recording electronic signals for later analysis in Washington. During the height of the Cold War, its mission was so sensitive that even photographing the airplane was considered a breach of security.
The airplane itself was so closely identified with a very classified mission that a photograph was seen as revealing the mission, which was utterly ironic because once the aircraft was airborne and off the coast of, say, the Soviet Union, Soviet pilots would come up and waste miles of Kodachrome taking photographs of the aircraft in excruciating detail.
On the 1st of September 1983, for several hours, the Soviets tracked a different version of the RC-135 named Cobra Ball. It regularly monitored compliance with nuclear treaties. Suddenly, on their radars, an object crossed into Soviet airspace. Interceptors were scrambled, the intruder was shot down. It was a Korean Airlines jumbo jet flight 007. 269 people perished. To this day, it's not known why the passenger jet was off course or if the Soviets mistook the Korean airliner for Cobra Ball. Some media reports claimed that an RC-135 rivet joint had provoked the tragedy, when in fact no rivet joint was in the area. After their brief but intense notoriety, the RC-135s returned to obscurity. During Operation Desert Shield, the 5-month buildup of U.S. and coalition forces in the region, rivet joint flew continuous 24-hour orbits along the Saudi-Iraqi border, methodically piecing together the building blocks of the Iraqi air defense system. One tactic involved sending fast-moving U.S. fighters towards Kuwait and Iraq, only to turn away at the last moment before crossing the border. The ensuing flurry of electronic activity was quietly monitored by the rivet joint from a safe distance. And although the Iraqis eventually caught on to the deception and quickly turned off their radars, the rivet joint needed only a few seconds to capture the essential information.
They might know that the Iraqis are using a radar at this particular frequency, which would facilitate the jamming capability, because then by narrowing the frequency range of the jammer, you can increase the power output rather than having a lesser power by covering more frequencies.
Of particular concern was the ability of the Iraqis to track the F-117 stealth fighter on radar.
The Iraqis are believed to have used low-frequency radar communications, which were possibly thought they might have a bearing on the detection of stealth fighters. And one of the primary targets which the RC-135 was used for was to detect the usage of these low-frequency radars so that coalition forces could go in and eliminate them.
The degree to which the supposedly invisible stealth was tracked by Iraqi radar was never revealed, even to congressional investigators conducting a classified analysis of the air war in the Gulf.
The only clearance we were denied was a report on the issue of guided SAM launches against the F-117s. We asked to see that report. We were denied access to that report.
For the first time on television, these images reveal rivet joint's inner chamber. The business end of an RC-135 is crammed with 45,000 pounds of high-power computers and displays, processing information at a rate equivalent to 10,000 of the fastest home computers. The electricity required to run this vast array is enough to light up several city blocks. 3 electronic warfare officers, called Ravens, locate and analyze enemy radars. Another 12 to 16 information operators from the Air Force's Air Intelligence Agency, many of them trained linguists, oversee the aircraft's most secretive collection task, communications intelligence, or COMINT.
They start listening to the conversation. Pilots talking to the control tower, the ground intercept controllers talking to the pilots, in different units in the field.
Although the specifics of its COMINT missions during the Gulf War remain classified, it is likely that rivet joint played a key role in what has been described as the strategic intelligence coup of the war.
The US National Security Agency, the eavesdropping people, managed to intercept several conversations between Saddam Hussein himself and Nezar Hamdoun, who was his ambassador at the UN in New York. And those conversations provided an absolutely critical insight into Saddam's state of mind and what he really believed he could achieve at different times. So, for example, shortly before the ground war, a lot of us who were covering the story at the time were wondering, well, is this ground war really necessary? And the confidence with people like President Bush expressed that a ground war was necessary seemed a bit puzzling to us. And I think now one can say with hindsight that he was privy to this extraordinary strategic intelligence, which showed that Saddam still thought that his ground forces could bog down the coalition.
It'll be many years before the extent of Rivet Joint's exploits in the Gulf War are fully known, but its vigil in the skies of the Middle East and around the world will certainly continue for the foreseeable future. In the weeks following the Iraqi invasion, as American aircraft and troops flowed into the Persian Gulf, a far-reaching controversy surrounding the use of air power welled up from the basement of the Pentagon. It would influence the most concentrated and sustained air campaign unleashed since World War II. Ever since the early 1920s, the advertised potential of aerial bombing to render an enemy helpless from the skies had been an elusive goal. During the Cold War, strategic bombing had become synonymous with obliterating an enemy with the awesome power of nuclear weapons. No sooner had Saddam Hussein made his fateful move than a small Air Force think tank called Checkmate began formulating the use of conventional or non-nuclear bombing in the Persian Gulf crisis. Checkmate's leader, Colonel John Warden, held as an article of faith that air power, using new precision-guided weapons, could by itself topple the Iraqi regime and force its withdrawal from Kuwait. Warden's strategy, called decapitation, or inside-out warfare, targeted so-called centers of gravity, with the Iraqi leadership and command authority providing the bullseye, followed by key production sites, infrastructure, propaganda directed at civilians, and finally, putting bombs on the Iraqi army in the field. This did not conform to U.S. military doctrine that had evolved since the early 1980s to counter numerically superior Warsaw Pact forces. The Americans emphasized a use of air power that was closely linked to, some would even say dictated by, the needs of the ground commander. This doctrine chafed at strategic bombing advocates like John Warden. Checkmate's grandiose scheme would likely have remained just an interesting theory had not General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, thrust himself into the debate. Headquartered at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, Central Command is responsible for Persian Gulf security matters. Seeking to redress the experience of the Vietnam War when President Johnson selected targets from the Oval Office, the authority and independence of theater commanders like Schwarzkopf had been strengthened by Congress, removing both the Pentagon and the White House from day-to-day battlefield operations. CENTCOM's air commander, Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, a veteran fighter pilot, was clear about his mission:
especially proud
to support Schwarzkopf, the theater commander-in-chief, the SINC, whose orders from President Bush in August of 1990 were to get forces into the region to defend Saudi Arabia. There was, as yet, no talk of forcibly expelling Iraq from Kuwait. Nevertheless, Schwarzkopf was worried about Saddam's next move and the number of Iraqis arrayed against his meager CENTCOM forces. They would be mere speed bumps in countering any serious Iraqi move against Saudi Arabia. Without consulting Horner, Schwarzkopf called the Pentagon on the 8th of August. He wanted help in developing what he called a strategic campaign.
The initial days after the invasion shows the importance of chance and happenstance in the formulation of plans and activities. When Schwarzkopf called the air staff to ask for assistance, this is an unusual event. Not only is a combatant command asking for air staff help, but the combatant commander is an Army officer who is asking for an Air Force officer to devise an Air Force plan to defeat an enemy. And so that's quite unusual.
In pointed contrast to the slow escalation of Vietnam's Rolling Thunder bombing campaign, Checkmate's aerial offensive against Iraq was named Instant Thunder. Top secret briefing was part theory and part operational plan. It called for a mix of 500 aircraft targeting some 90 locations, all inside Iraq. Worden estimated the job could be done in only 6 to 9 consecutive days if the weather held out.
Instead of gradual buildup and instead of sending messages, the message that would be sent by Instant Thunder was a sudden, devastating, simultaneous attack on all kinds of targets and all areas within the Iraqi military and government that supported its war effort.
Schwarzkopf was greatly impressed with the plan, but Instant Thunder was not met with universal enthusiasm. The Navy, always leery of strategic bombing claims, dismissed it as distant blunder. The plan not only violated the precept of keeping the Pentagon out of the war-fighting business, but critics also suggested it might trigger the unpredictable Saddam into attacking Israel, or even Saudi Arabia. Furthermore, Worden's centers of gravity didn't include the 17 Iraqi divisions inside Kuwait and literally poised on the Saudi border.
Along or about the 20th, 21st of August, John Worden brings his plan and several personnel to brief General Horner on his strategic plan to defeat the Iraqi military. Horner, however, is worried about the direct political and military threat of the Iraqi troops, and he questions Worden very hard on the practical and immediate military problems. What happens if the Iraqis come right now? How does the strategic plan defeat the Iraqis right now? How do you engage in interdiction? Tell me about air refueling routes. Well, Worden hadn't worked that out.
The colonel was informed that his services would not be further required in country. The next day, he was on a plane back to Washington. Worden's hasty departure notwithstanding, in August of 1990, Instant Thunder was the only far-reaching proposal on the table. And it provided the foundation for planning the actual air campaign that would emerge over the coming months. As diplomacy failed to budge the Iraqi dictator, President Bush marshaled international support and prepared his countrymen for the coming military showdown. One aspect of planning the air war that had top priority was defeating Iraq's formidable air defenses. Losses on the first day of airstrikes were estimated to be as high as 100 aircraft. Baghdad bristled with more than 7 times the number of surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, than were in Hanoi at the height of the Vietnam War.
My experience in flying over North Vietnam definitely had a great impact on my thinking. We never really went after their Air Force, except after they took off. We never got a good grip on their command and control. Some of those things were emblazoned in my mind, and I watched a lot of people pay a bitter price.
Brigadier General Larry Henry, a decorated former WISO, or Weapons Systems Officer in Vietnam, was the Air Force's leading authority on air defense suppression and electronic combat. He was given 3 hours' notice to get on an airplane to Saudi Arabia.
When I got there, I set about setting up an electronic combat planning organization by gathering people from the deploying units to include Navy and Marine expertise so that we could integrate electronic combat assets into a team.
Henry ruled out attacking Iraqi air defenses piecemeal or incrementally as had been attempted in Vietnam. On the 21st of August, 1990, his group issued an important classified document, a joint concept of operations for electronic warfare, the first one ever to be executed in wartime. He planned a massive coordinated strike on the air defense system to break it into chunks and then smash it to pieces.
The whole business about an integrated air defense system is that you can have an emitter over here, you can have a radar looking, and you can shoot a missile over here without it exposing itself. And that's the danger. These guys can pop up and kill you before you ever know you're being looked at.
Using the data provided by Rivet Joint and other intelligence sources, General Henry and his group probed the electronic connections of the system's brain, watching how Iraqi ground controllers performed, learning where radar coverage was spotty.
You've got to understand how it's all put together, how it works, how the information is put out to those people that are going to shoot you. And then you deny those shooters that information.
On the diplomatic front, the UN issued a January 15th deadline for Iraq to either withdraw from Kuwait or face military action. In Saudi Arabia, detailed planning for CENTCOM's air campaign had been turned over to Air Force Brigadier General Buster Glasson. Larry Henry's electronic warfare group joined Glasson's planners in a converted 30 by 50 foot storage room, euphemistically called the Black Hole.
One stage, I finally felt like that I had a good understanding of their air defense system, how it worked.
But there was a critical piece missing from Henry's puzzle. Months before, engineers from Northrop Corporation in California had approached the Air Force with a plan to use Navy target drones as a deception.
It employs reflectors to make the drone look like manned aircraft. And the concept was to use the target vehicles as decoys to stimulate the surface-to-air missile sites and force them to show their position.
Henry included decoys in the Iraq planning, but ironically, there were none in the Air Force inventory. Several types were under consideration when Northrop stepped forward. Although the BQM-74 drone had shown its potential, the small jet-powered vehicle would have to be substantially modified, deployed into harsh desert conditions, and be fully operational, all in a breathtakingly short span of time.
Well, a typical cycle to go from presentation of a concept to contract to implementation is at least 2 years, probably closer to 3 by the time you really get out in the field. We did it in days.
Called in to work with Northrop was a shadowy group of facilitators from the Air Force Logistics Command. Called Big Safari, the group provided special management services to classified programs. Under the codename Skaithmeen, some 20 companies nationwide, large and small, became involved in a frenzied effort to deliver a combat-ready package of decoys to Saudi Arabia in just 30 days, in total secrecy. Lockheed Corporation helped to coordinate the effort. Big Safari turned to the only Air Force personnel experienced in launching missiles under austere field conditions. Nuclear-armed ground-launched cruise missiles, or GLICMs, had been withdrawn from Europe as part of a 1987 arms reduction treaty. They were being dismantled. A former GLICM commander, Colonel Doug Livingston, who'd never even heard of the Northrop drone, was ordered from his base in Arizona to a location in Southern California to view some unfamiliar equipment.
A major from Air Staff said, "We need you in theater in 2 weeks." And you could have knocked me over with a feather when he told me that.
Livingston was ordered to select 40 GLICM alumni to receive a crash course on setting up and launching the drones.
I turned in the list Monday morning. Wednesday night, everyone was in California. That's how quickly things happened.
After a quick orientation from the Navy, 40 of the crated drones, tons of support equipment, and Livingston's crew were loaded onto 3 giant C-5 transports. Secrecy was essential. Even family members were unaware that their loved ones were deploying to the Gulf. From the moment the hastily assembled decoy crews arrived in Saudi Arabia, their lives were transformed by constant training and the exhortations of General Larry Henry, who bestowed on the orphan unit his longtime call sign, Puba.
We were talking over the Saudi telephone system. I couldn't say anything about, I want this to do that, so I said, your name is now Puba's Party.
He was our cheerleader, if you will. We'd go out to train and he'd say, I'm coming with you. General Henry was normally about 300 miles from where we were. And he would come to our location and by golly, he would deploy with us.
The January 15th deadline for Iraq to leave Kuwait came and passed. Beneath the ominous calm, the die had been cast. President Bush signed the directive authorizing the start of the war. In Saudi Arabia, most aircraft were put on ground alert, ostensibly as a precaution against a preemptive Iraqi attack. The real reason was to allow final mission planning. Crews were briefed, aircraft were armed. The first strike on Baghdad, H hour, was set for 3 a.m.
On the 15th of January, when the deadline approached, you could feel tension in the air because nobody knew what was going to happen. The drones were fueled, everything was ready, and all it would take is somebody to say, Livingston, you and your people go, and we were ready to go.
At 2:38 a.m. on the 17th of January, 1991, the pre-dawn silence was shattered by a barrage of Hellfire missiles unleashed by Army Apache gunships. Guided to their launch points by ground-hugging Air Force Pave-Low Special Operations helicopters, the Apache's mission was to destroy 2 clusters of early warning radars in southern Iraq. Operation Desert Storm had begun. At H hour, exactly 3 a.m., F-117s released the first laser-guided bombs on the telecommunications building in the Iraqi capital. Minutes later, Navy Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from ships in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea found their targets in Baghdad. Some of the Tomahawks had been modified for an unusual reason.
Use of special non-lethal warheads, and it was a carbon wire warhead. This warhead would fly over an outdoor electrical grid. It would spew out like a spider web of these little wires, specially constructed to increase their conductivity, and they would settle like a spider web over these outdoor grids, and that would immediately trip the circuit breakers in the power generating plant. They would go offline. Now, they knew that these power plants were what drove with the mainframe computers that integrated all these air defenses.
While the Iraqis were firing at shadows, a second force bore in. Puba's Party, right on cue. For the first time on television, this video shows the actual launch of the BQM-74 decoys.
These BQM-74s come flying in. They look like a fleet of airplanes. Now, the integration of the air defense system is destroyed. They can no longer look at these planes from somewhere else. So each radar for each missile system has to come up.
Deprived of their master control, radar operators defending the Iraqi capital painted the night sky with powerful electronic beams, like hundreds of searchlights piercing the darkness. by exposing their locations, they were committing mass suicide.
The next part of the plan is that there's somewhere, and depending on who you talk to, 50 to 200 HARM missiles, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, that are coming right behind them. So as these radars come up to wipe out this second wave of aircraft, they are just hammered by this waves of anti-radiation missiles.
In the 3 hours before sunrise on the first day of Operation Desert Storm, more than 400 combat aircraft swarmed over the border to hit targets throughout Iraq. 3 waves of stealth fighters revisited Baghdad, hitting the air defense centers and Iraqi command and leadership facilities, the centers of gravity, the very heart of John Warden's instant thunder. The use of decoys combined with anti-radiation missiles was crucial to suppressing Iraq's missile defenses, leading to unrelenting Allied aerial bombing attacks, night and day. A 43-day rain of steel that preceded the ground assault to liberate Kuwait. By day 5 of the war, ground-based Iraqi radar defenses were effectively eliminated. But suppression efforts continued. Rivet joint operations, far from subsiding, became more intense.
What very few people realize is that although the first few days of the war clearly destroyed most of the Iraqi air defense capability, there were still mobile SA-6 sites, for example. Their radar would appear for minutes at a time, go away, and then appear a couple days later somewhere else. And one of the things that Rivet Joint did was maintain an accurate picture of the enemy electronic order of battle.
During the whole of the air campaign, only 10 aircraft were lost to Iraqi radar-guided missiles. A remarkably low number when considering that coalition forces flew nearly 70,000 combat sorties.
If we'd have lost a bunch of airplanes right at first, it could have swayed public support that were behind the whole Allied effort. And if you'd have had a scenario where you had a bunch of POWs being drugged through the streets by a bunch of mad Iraqis, such as you saw in North Vietnam, it would have affected how the public perceived the thing.
And public perception was important.
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
The Pentagon masterfully orchestrated the ebb and flow of information during the war. That was how the world was introduced to the wonders of so-called smart bombs that seemed to have been designed by public relations genius.
And this is my counterpart's headquarters in Baghdad. This is the headquarters of the Air Force, and keep your eye on all sides of the building as the airplane overflies the building and drops the bomb down through the center of the building.
Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
No sooner had the last sortie been flown than another offensive was launched. A combined effort by the Defense Department and arms manufacturers aimed at protecting expensive systems from budget-cutting politicians and bureaucrats.
Basically, aside from Desert Storm being somewhat of a success story as far as the American military goes, it's also a success story for American technology and American industry.
The F-117A has demonstrated that it has unmatched survivability while destroying high-value targets in a dense threat environment. In a world where potential adversaries may possess superior numbers of weapons and near technological parity, the F-117A stealth fighter is a vital defense asset.
The initial claims of the effectiveness of stealth technology and smart bombs have since been qualified.
The contention that the combination of stealth and laser-guided bombs had this unique effect on the first hours of the first night, and in their words, revolutionized warfare, all of those assertions were not supported by the data.
One of the justifications for the stealth fighter's high cost of maintenance and operations is that it can go unprotected and unescorted where non-stealthy aircraft fear to tread. Actually, during the Gulf War, the F-117 received quite a lot of help, as from this radar-jamming EF-111.
Interviewed about 100 pilots, and about a dozen of them F-117 pilots. One of them said an interesting thing about jamming. He said that for them, it was like American Express. Don't leave home without it.
And as to the accuracy claims of laser-guided bombing?
Pilots told us, the manuals told us, the physics told us that these things do not operate effectively in clouds, in dust, and even in humidity. And we're talking about the Persian Gulf here. We're not talking about the Vietnamese jungle.
Post-war analysis has since determined that smart bombs were indeed smart only 40% of the time. But probably the most compelling secret of the air war, and one that still resonates, was how an effective air strategy was created and implemented in the face of myriad communication and coordination problems. Air Force computers couldn't network with the Navy's. In some cases, Army and Air Force radios were incompatible. After the first week of the air campaign, selection of targets became a daily 18-hour marathon race between intelligence and operations. Where to send the strike aircraft? What to arm them with? Would there be enough aerial tanker support? Finally liberated from official Washington interference, CENTCOM battle commanders developed ad hoc arrangements for critical information from personal contacts and associations inside the Pentagon, sneaking in the back door, so to speak, because the black hole required information faster than was available through established channels. In planning and executing the air campaign, the secure telephone became General Glossen's personal link to intelligence, not from his own specialists in Saudi Arabia, but from the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, thousands of miles away.
Officers in the black hole said, basically, that we don't have time for this, and we can win the war without the formal part of the intelligence organization helping us. We can get that help that we need to figure out what targets to attack and to evaluate our attacks elsewhere, and they did.
The air campaign during the Gulf War marks a turning point in the application of air power. Secret advanced technology sensors provided vital information on the enemy's capabilities, even the enemy's frame of mind. Yet the demand for that information, immediate information, overwhelmed the means of dissemination.
The fog of war was not lifted. Friction of war was not lifted. There was no one single coherent picture of this war. And the fact that we fight now with such a complicated organizational structure means that for our senior leaders, they don't really understand what's going on. They want to present the image that they understand what is going on in the war. In point of fact, they neither understand nor can they manage what is going on in that war. There are too many people, there are too many weapon systems, there are too many activities going on to understand.
Luckily for the United States and its coalition allies, whatever command and control difficulties they experienced were dwarfed by those of Saddam Hussein. It is unlikely that the next adversary will be so accommodating. But in analyzing the war's problems and successes, it's important to consider one overriding fact. This was the first military engagement in recent history in which the needs of battlefield commanders, for the most part, outweighed political considerations. From the standpoint of those tasked to go and fight, that was no small achievement.
If you want to ask me my overall impression of how we prosecuted this war, we used common sense. And one of the things I found out in my career is common sense isn't common.